All right, everybody, welcome to the podcast. We're doing one of those shows today that is going to be counter programming. I'm obviously doing a lot of thinking and writing and tweeting about the unrest and the police abuse. But while that is happening, other big important things are happening in the world, and we're going to talk about one of them today. Our guest is Dr. Jonathan D.T. Ward. He's the author of China's Vision of Victory. He's an internationally recognized expert on U.S.-China strategic competition. He's also the founder of Atlas Organization, a Washington, D.C.-based consultancy focused on the rise of India and China. Jonathan Ward, welcome to the news.
Hello, Matt. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
It is great to talk with you. As I mentioned, it's a weird time, but this is an important topic. I guess a couple months ago, I had some folks on talking about China, but I feel like you, a little bit more than, you are probably more concerned than they are in terms of the sense that China is attempting to displace us and replace us as the superpower in the world. Why is it? I mean, obviously, everybody knows China is a behemoth. Why is it that some people who are knowledgeable of China aren't as concerned about their desire for hegemony?
I think it depends on what their area of knowledge is. I mean, in my case, I've spent most of my adult life studying.
Or is it hegemony?
Sure, fair enough.
I don't know.
Well, that's the thing is, I've spent a lot of my time understanding China's vision of the future, the fact that their leadership really does have this comprehensive vision for what the world is going to look like, essentially under their domination, and that they're executing this strategy just year by year, month by month, decade by decade. And what this is, I mean, they've been very clear about it, and that it includes everything from seabed to space, from Africa to the Antarctic, from artificial intelligence to hypersonic missiles. They have a very comprehensive program here to become the dominant power in the world and to reshape the entirety of world affairs such that they are the dominant force. And for a place like totalitarian China to become such a force in world affairs would be a turning point that we'd really never have a chance to go back from that. So I think it's incredibly important that America, very broadly, that we come to an understanding that this is what we're facing in the world and that it will affect us. I mean, we can't hide from this. As bad as things are right now, there's a proposition out there by a hostile superpower to make things far, far worse for pretty much everybody but themselves.
Talk about your background, how you came to this belief and how you came to know about China.
Sure. So my background, in my early 20s and sort of late teens, I started learning foreign languages. I was very interested in, my goal as a teenager was to learn the most widely spoken languages in the world so that I could talk to as many people on the planet as possible and sort of learn what was going on in my lifetime. So I learned Russian and Chinese, ultimately Arabic, grew up with French and Spanish, things like that, and spent about 5 years living out of a backpack in Russia, China, India, Latin America, Middle East. And in my early 20s, after doing my undergrad work in Russian and Chinese language at Columbia, I spent my first year basically backpacking around China and was out in Xinjiang in Tibet, traveling with truck caravans, staying in very remote areas. I got to see those two places. And, today we know Xinjiang because the Chinese Communist Party has over 1 million people in concentration camps there. I mean, a decade ago when I was out there traveling around and living with people in villages and such, I got to see the sort of pre-digital version of a place that was completely under the thumb of this regime. It was pretty horrific. And then Tibet was also a place that had clearly, its freedoms had been, destroyed by the Communist Party. My sort of travels in that country continued for quite a long time. I went across the South China Sea by a cargo ship, rode a bicycle across southern China, got to know China, not the way a student would or a business person would, or even a diplomat would, but really by going out into very remote places, living in villages, staying with people, totally immersed in the language, getting to know the worldview of just regular people all over the country. And that led to a sense that this country was going to be, a very new force in world affairs, and that it wasn't going to be all positive. I mean, this was going to be a very dangerous problem for the United States. I mean, people were focused on doing business in Shanghai and Beijing and Guangzhou and, what have you. And they just didn't really know what the country was like, how the people had been taught to see the world by the Communist Party, which of course had been in charge since 1949. And then I wound up at Oxford doing my PhD in, initially I was admitted for Russia-China relations, then moved into China-India, and gained access to Communist Party archives in Beijing that have now been shut down to the world. And that began my journey in terms of not just what is the worldview of China as a nation, but what is the strategic thinking of China's leaders? And my work then was about China's war with India. I mean, what was the nature of their collapse in relations with India? And right now we have a China-India border crisis that's very significant. We can talk about that too. But I began this sort of decade-long immersion in the nature of this place and what its ambitions are.
So, I mean, I think one thing that Americans like to do is to say, the problem is the Chinese Communist Party, it's the leaders, but the Chinese people are great. And maybe they are, but it sounds to me like you're saying that the average Chinese person may have had instilled in them this propaganda and this worldview, and that they're on board in some cases with this plan for global domination. I don't want to put words in your mouth. Is there some truth to that?
Well, I think what I'm saying is that it's true that the Communist Party has dominated China's political discourse to the exclusion of all other possibilities for 70 years, right? And there are many people that do not want that do not like that aren't even aware of what the leadership's real plans are, by the way. I mean, most people, I think, do not necessarily understand how this entire vision coheres. I mean, that took a huge amount of work to put the whole thing together. And I don't think that's necessarily known to the average person in China. On the other hand, the vision of China as a nation that is restoring itself to glory, I think, is well understood. And I think that is something that, rather than a concept of the individual in China as totally repressed, I think you find many people that do believe that China is going to come to become the most powerful force. And I encountered that kind of thinking all the time. I mean, there's something that many people who travel to China have heard the same little anecdote, which is the 20th century belonged to America, but the 21st century will belong to China. I mean, that's something that, whether it was master's degree students in international relations telling me how they plan to dominate the South China Sea, or whether it was, just people selling me a newspaper telling me that they would like to go to war with Vietnam. This is not something that Americans get to understand because, again, people aren't traveling in the country. They're not speaking, to regular people about international issues. So I think there's a much deeper nationalism there. And by the way, we were told throughout the 2000s by China experts in America and the West that the Communist Party was in fact a restraining factor on the nationalism that existed in certain parts of the population. So there are really these two forces in China. One is the Communist Party itself, and the other is a sort of militant nationalism that exists, I think, on one hand, stoked by the party, but on the other hand, I was meeting people all the time telling me Xi Jinping's not tough enough. He should seize the South China Sea the way that Putin seized Crimea. These people had nothing to do with the party. I mean, they read its newspapers, they listened to its television, they listened to its radio.
Maybe it's like they'd make some good Trump voters over here.
I don't know. I mean, it was,
you don't have to comment. You don't have to comment on my editorializing. Listen, I remember the whole, most favored nation debate, and there was a sense in America amongst a lot of conservatives that free markets and opening up the economy would lead to a desire for not just economic freedom, but political freedom, and that the regime might even either liberalize or even just be toppled as a result of that. That does not seem to have, now, it's like the French Revolution is too soon to say, but it doesn't seem to have panned out. Was that a huge mistake? Did America basically let China back in the game? And now we're going to pay for it?
Yes, that's pretty much exactly how that goes. And think about where that whole idea comes from, though. It's this idea that they're going to liberalize, that they're going to get rich. I mean, that was basically a conversation with ourselves. I mean, there was no interlocutor to that conversation. It's basically a theory that we developed. I remember when I was first headed to China, I was on the Trans-Siberian from Moscow to Beijing, and my great uncle, who was an officer in the OSS, during the Second World War, he was multilingual and working on some things there. He handed me a book. I just graduated from Columbia, and it was Thomas Friedman's The World is Flat. And he said, I've seen a lot, but it's your world now. Read this, see if it makes sense. And I'm reading The World is Flat on the train, an 8-day train ride from, across Siberia, through Mongolia, through into northern China. And I'm just thinking, this can't be right. I mean, this basically says that, the whole world is the same. You just search and replace economic variables, and you have a prediction of the future that essentially continues forever. And it was complete nonsense. It was complete nonsense. I mean, 4 months into my travels in China, being out in Xinjiang, hiding from the Chinese military in Tibet, things like that. It was very clear that the world was infinitely more complex than our theories could ever account for. And that lack of real experience in countries, I think, led to this myopia and to these fantasies about the outside world that are coming back to haunt us. And they do this again and again and again. This just happens to be the biggest one.
Well, there is a liberal naivete about the world, and it sounds like that's part of what the end of the world, or whatever, the end of history, did not pan out. There is a sense, though, that freedom wins because freedom allows for risk-taking, freedom allows for innovation. If you can make a mistake and you don't get sent to the gulag. China had the one-child policy for a long time, which could have all sorts of ramifications down the road. So there's a sense that maybe America will magically win because in the end, freedom triumphs because of innovation. And is that also quixotic?
No, I see. That's something that I actually would agree with. And I think that, after spending 10 years abroad, and I really just come back to the United States very recently, last couple of years, my life is going to be here, and it's for America and for our alliance system. I mean, that's where one has to invest our time now. But we do have, the American story is one, it's not this thing that's about the end of history. It's not about a total, victory over history. It's about a continuous, innovative sort of self-reinvention. I think that's our biggest strength, is that we do continue to invent and invent and invent. And that's how we've defeated everything in the past. It's how we've won. So you don't really get to take a break at the end, let's say, of the Second World War to the Cold War, Pax Americana. We're always going to be challenged by external forces. And the less that we understand those places, and the longer that we fail to understand them, the bigger that those challenges will become. But at the end of the day, I think there's this deep reservoir of potential in the United States that has not yet been realized. I think that that's really the thing that we can bring to any situation is the infinite potential of this country. We invent the future, we invent the frontier and the horizons. And you just think about all the things that are going to happen right now in terms of tech and economy and the rest of it. And we're going to have the Internet of Things. We're going to have AI. These can be major American strengths. But what you can't do is have your adversary taking advantage of your system. That's the problem we've got right now. The reason that freedom versus, let's say, totalitarianism or authoritarianism was a battle that we could win in, let's say, the Cold War, was because the Soviets were cut off from us. Today, China has done everything they can to, in 1980, they were, 90% agrarian. Now they're doing, artificial intelligence, and then they've got, Alibaba and Baidu and all the rest of it. And it's because they're attached to our system. And that's the thing. You can't win this thing until we're free to innovate without having our pockets picked by a hostile power. So we're going to have to make certain moves like that so that we can have that freedom back to build our own frontiers and to outpace these adversaries. And I'll just tell you, though, because, I'll give you an example of, when we think about one of the things that I think we can all return to, even in a time as dark as this, today in June 2020, you think about something like the space race, which was just such an incredible moment for Americans. And, it was just an undeniable good that we could go out and explore and build the technologies to do that. But here's China's vision of space. Let me tell you, this is from the director of their lunar mission. He says, the universe is an ocean. The moon is the Diaoyu Islands. Mars is Huangyan Island. These are islands that they claim in the South and East China Sea. If we don't go there now, even though we're capable of doing so, then we will be blamed by our descendants. If others go there, they will take over. This is reason enough. So they have this vision of dominating everything, including space, including the oceans. And that's what we're up against. People have taken our innovations and technologies and they're using them to execute this vision of total domination. So we have to get back in the game and we have to use our freedoms to build our own frontiers again.
But part of what's happened during this time, when the last 20, 30 years, is that American corporations have become global. And I don't know if you saw the South Park episode that really did a good job of lampooning this with like Winnie the Pooh and and all that stuff. If you haven't seen it, it's worth seeing. But there is this cultural contradiction of capitalism, right? So like a lot of capitalists in America, whether it's the NBA or Nike or whatever, like they do not want Disney. They do not want to offend China because there's over 1 billion potential consumers in China. So being good capitalists, they don't want to do anything that would offend China. And the same, I'm sure, is true of a lot of tech companies, social media platforms, tech companies who want to sell to China. And we're in it, right? And so maybe our motives were good. Like we thought that, giving them a taste of free markets and prosperity would ultimately lead to something good. But now maybe we're starting to realize it's just not going to pan out. That was a naive idea. Do we need, and there are particularly Republicans, the Josh Hawleys of the world, the Tom Cottons of the world, who are pushing, maybe even Ted Cruz, something of like, let's just admit that we're in a war with China and like quit pussyfooting around it. Like this is going to be the new Cold War. And in a war, you don't do business with not just your adversary, but with your enemy. Should we think of China? Should we consider that China is not an adversary, but is an enemy, and that we are at war with them in a Cold War?
Well, I think that this is where it is very important to draw the distinction between the Communist Party of China and China as a nation state or the people of China. I think there's no question that the Communist Party of China is a hostile entity. It now controls the People's Republic of China and thus is marshaling the resources of such a state against not only the United States but many other places. They're in a confrontation right now with India on India's border. They're harassing Australia over trade ties. They're threatening Japan in the East China Sea. They're threatening the Southeast Asians in the South China Sea. They're essentially mobilizing on all fronts with the backing of Russia, by the way, and that sort of entente is, I think, quite powerful right now in its way. So yes, you have a hostile force now, and we have to recognize that is true. Someday we may, China was an ally of the United States in the Second World War under Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang, which of course fled to Taiwan after the Civil War. So you have had variations of China that were in fact our allies. But that's not true with the Communist Party. So we have to work our way through that problem. Someday it's possible that we'll have a better, healthier relationship with whatever emerges in the future. But at present, we are going to have to wage this strategic competition against this place, the Communist Party and the People's Republic of China. So, this is, we've got to refocus on that. And I think it has to be an awakening across the American public. And you've made a very important point about the corporations. I mean, those companies went out essentially into Thomas Friedman land, into the world is flat. First they sought labor arbitrage in China. Then it was a billion customers. Now it's simply the growth of China as a whole that they're looking to capture. So, we can't have our corporates beholden to a hostile state. There's no question. So I think it's time to re-examine the nature of the American corporation. This idea that corporations are not American, that they're multinational. I think that idea, is over. I mean, the death of the multinational corporation is going to happen because, there are going to be major changes in supply chains and what's possible in other markets, and how companies have to collaborate with the U.S. government on certain things, and how they can't go into China for certain things. I mean, you think about a place which, once again, has put 1 million people into concentration camps, and is developing a military that, as Xi Jinping says, is preparing to fight and win wars. I mean, our companies are out there partnering with Chinese companies right now that are involved in those operations, from concentration camps to, avionics. So we've got to rethink all of that. And I think that is where the American consumer really needs to have a voice on these issues as moral issues.
Now, it feels to me like this is something, I mean, Donald Trump says great things about China and Xi, and then bad things. It's hard to tell where he is, but it does feel like Josh Hawley and Tom Cotton, and maybe even Ted Cruz, maybe Marco Rubio, that Senate Republicans are taking the leadership here on being China hawks. And like somebody proposed recently, I forget who, that a Chinese national shouldn't be allowed to come to America and like get a degree in like the STEM fields or something like that. I don't want to mischaracterize it, but it was something like that. Is this an issue that is like Republicans are more championing now, or do you think this is like a fait accompli regardless?
I think it's interestingly and importantly bipartisan, and this is one of the most important things we've got right now. And I guess here we are in probably the most divided version of America that our generation has ever seen, and even the boomers are speaking that way. But we have to come together on this issue. I mean, the biggest challenge for America now is, can we deal with a strategic competition like this of the scale of the USSR, or even of Nazi Germany? I mean, depending on how it evolves, can we do that as a divided nation? That's going to be our biggest, and I don't think we can. So we are going to have to find common ground, and I think on the China issue thus far there is common ground. I mean, this is something where clearly there are Republican voices in the Senate, Rubio and Hawley and Cotton, and Cruz and Sass and a whole bunch of others that are making it clear that they understand the situation. But also on the Democratic side, I mean, Schumer, I think, has been very vocal on, and Warner, and then Nancy Pelosi's been vocal on human rights since. But I mean, she cares about Tibet when no one else is thinking about it. And so there is this important coalition, I think, to be built on Democrats on human rights, Republicans on national security, and we have to come together. Because there's an adage that has been attributed to sort of a Chinese proverb. I can't remember where I learned it a long time ago, but they used to say that a dynasty falls in China when there are two forces that threaten it. One is an external threat, and the other is an internal threat. And that's what leads to the collapse of a society. And here we have, I think, very clearly, our own divisions are the internal problem we have as a country. I mean, can we sustain this? How will it go? That we don't know. But then we also have this external problem on the scale of which we have not seen in 50 years. And that is China's ambitions, backed by Russia. You potentially add other states to that coalition that seeks to break down and take apart the American era. I mean, if you take that external problem of China and you marry it with our internal divisions, we could be in very serious trouble. So we must remain united in order to handle the external side.
Um, so I thought it'd be best to start off with like an extemporaneous conversation, and at some point I'm going to turn to some prepared questions I have, and we can maybe do kind of a lightning round with that. But I'm going to keep just talking as long as I have thoughts or questions. Um, okay, so you mentioned during World War II we were, you know, allied with China under a different regime. And then, of course, Nixon opens up China, but we're in a Cold War with Russia. So we're kind of, everything we're doing is in the context of beating Russia and sort of trolling them. But that happened. And then we went into the world is flat era of trying to open up China economically. And now we finally, it seems like we're now at a turning point where we are going to, and by the way, we haven't really invoked COVID-19 and coronavirus, but I think that has helped, depending on how you look at it. But it's helped, I think, turn some public opinion against China here in America, fairly or not.
Matt, sorry, 1 second. The last 20 seconds got cut off. You said a turning point, and then it froze.
It says my internet is unstable. So here's the problem with social distancing is that my entire family is home and they're all probably streaming stuff on Wi-Fi right now. God knows what, video games and whatnot. So, I guess my point is, I'll just get to the question. So we went through that period where we were doing business with China under, I hope, noble motives. From China's standpoint, though, was this all part of their plan? Like, did they see this as, okay, we're going to do business with the Americans, that's going to buy us time to try to get rich and catch up with them technologically. Let's steal as much intellectual property as possible during that time. But at some point, they're going to catch on. At some point, hopefully it'll be too late, but at some point, the Americans are going to get wise to this. And then we're going to be in something of a competition with them. But let's try to ride this out as long as we can. Like, were they thinking that deviously?
No, I think you've described it pretty well, actually. And the reason is, early after the founding of the People's Republic of China, Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, who were part of the founding, they created the place essentially. They had this vision of surpassing America economically, and that ultimately, because of China's large population, they would be a larger economic power. And you're talking about real communists back then, Marxist-Leninists. So they still believed that they would be the dominant economy. And then, of course, Deng Xiaoping opens up, starts to bring in as much foreign technology and training and the rest of it they can. I mean, China was always focused on improving its technological capabilities. And initially, it relied on the USSR, and then ultimately it had the US and our free market system to work from. And then what Deng Xiaoping used to call it, hide your brightness, bide your time. So I don't know if anyone could be clearer than that. The whole idea was, yes, we're going to essentially become more powerful, and then we'll talk about what happens next. And then, of course, in the 2000s, Hu Jintao talks about the peaceful rise of China. And Chinese strategists start to come up with this idea of what they call the period of strategic opportunity. And the period of strategic opportunity was meant to last from the year 2000 to the year 2020. And that period was one where you could say that, China's rise is peaceful, and, the world is sort of going to go along with it and we'll be fine. But eventually that will change, because China's accrued sufficient power to do different things. And I'm going to read you a passage from China's Vision of Victory, which was something in the China Daily, which is about as official as it gets. And back to that idea of the period of strategic opportunity, where nobody would catch on, and then building China's power. And it says, no one can deny that China's rise has been peaceful, and China has reason to maintain and even extend the period of strategic opportunity well beyond 2020, as it aims to realize the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation by 2049, when the People's Republic of China celebrates its centenary. If China can rise smoothly to the top of the world without firing a single bullet, it will certainly be able to claim the moral high ground. This may sound harsh, but the truth is that peace is not a godsend. It often has to be earned, sometimes at the cost of war. So, this is also a country that's reinvested all of that engagement, all of those technological gains into a military that's modeled on the US joint force. And then Xi Jinping speaks of things like preparing to fight and win wars. So we really have a problem on our hands.
I want to ask you about that, because there's a way of looking at this that says, okay, look, I mean, China is a big, important country, and it makes perfect sense that they should be successful, maybe even be, a unipolar sort of world where they have their sphere of influence. Maybe they should control, Asia. Who's to say that's not really our turf? I mean, why are we? I'm playing devil's advocate here.
Sure.
Right? You get the point. That's their area, and why shouldn't they control their area, their sphere of influence? And we can coexist, right? We could coexist with them. They leave us alone, we leave them alone. Is there reason for us to fear their military, that it's not going to stop with live and let live, but that we could potentially be in a shooting war with a billion plus Chinese?
Well, see, that's the issue, is at a certain point, it's about the extent of these ambitions, right? I mean, is Asia really the end goal? And it's not, and here's, I'm going to read you another passage from the book that's probably never been translated into English. And this is
translating on the fly?
No, I translated these during the whole course of working on the book project. But here's something from a couple of the Belt and Road Initiative, right? I mean, many people have heard of that. It's this entire network that's meant to bring Europe, Africa, all of Asia, all of Eurasia, basically everything except the United States, into a place where China is the dominant trading partner and the economic center of gravity. And then their military strategies are meant to defend what they call their ceaselessly expanding interests. So it's basically old school British imperialism, but then it's backed by this sort of Leninist totalitarianism. So it's a totally expansionary global ambition. And this passage, which is sort of it's unofficial, but it's from the Chinese Academy of Sciences, which is official. So it says this: resources are always scarce. A great nation cannot be stuffed into a narrow space forever. The Eurasian continent is the source where China's national interests are concentrated. It provides a vast stage on which to carry out China's 21st century geopolitical strategy. As a result of the interaction of the crystallization of the highest wisdom of the Chinese nation and the conditions of the era, the One Belt, One Road strategy has announced to the world that the rise of China has arrived, becoming an important starting point for China to go global. So the idea is that they're going to take all these continents, and this includes Latin America now, and there's even a Belt and Road for the Arctic. They also have their space Belt and Road. It's unlimited, right? It's unlimited.
There are regimes like the Iranian regime, which talk a lot of shit. They do a lot of saber rattling, but it's but they don't really mean the great Satan. Is there reason to believe that China, when they say things internally, that we should take them at their word more than some of these other, sort of tin horn dictators or whatever?
Well, you have to think about the fact that China, as it stands today, is probably the most powerful nation in history other than the United States itself. So it's one thing for anyone globally to say, to have their piece, but I mean, what really matters is the actions. And you look at the success of all these programs thus far, and you look at the success of China's military buildup, you look at the success of Made in China 2025 thus far, to a point. Their ability to build their industries, to build their military, to build their global diplomacy, to become, in fact, the world's top trading nation. They surpassed the United States in 2013 in terms of amount of goods sold. They're the top trading partner for the plurality of nations in the world now. They are the second largest economy. Yeah. These are real things. So there's really two sides to it. One is the vision. The other is, will the vision succeed? And I think they've succeeded well enough for us to take them seriously. And hence, that's reason enough for the entirety of American international strategy to organize around making sure that they don't succeed all the way, because then we'd be in a very different world.
Yeah. Well, I want to ask you, like, I think we've sort of established that the Clinton, Clinton, Bush, Obama, strategy was probably naive. I want to get your take on how we're playing our hands now, or we're playing our hand now with Trump. I mean, for example, getting out of the TPP, I'm not an expert, but my understanding is that would have actually allowed us to have more to keep China in check. That by getting out of some of these global organizations and alliances, we are actually empowering China. Love to get your take on sort of modern politics, the Trump era. How are we playing our hand? Are we doing better with China or worse?
Well, I think we really have to go back to first principles here. And, we haven't had a national grand strategy really since the Solarium project under Eisenhower. And at that time, you really had the sort of Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy continuum that set us up over, a little bit more than a decade to have a US global strategy that allowed us to win the Cold War, to come straight out of the Second World War and win the Cold War. Here what you have, I think the fundamental contribution of this administration is to essentially move from an engagement strategy to a competition strategy. And I think from competition, we're going to, the strategy will harden from there, because the reality of what we're dealing with is pretty real. And I think COVID, teaches us some lessons as to what's really going on here that we can talk about. But that's an important turning point. I think that was starting in the Obama administration here and there with the pivot to Asia, with rejection of China's new model for great power relations. But fundamentally, I think that there was a turning point with the trade war, with the national security strategy, with the NDS, with all of these, and with, I think at this point, the full engagement of U.S. government on the problem of China, from the State Department to the Commerce Department. The whole thing is now turning. The aircraft carriers turning, and it will be very important to sustain that, for successive administrations, until we really have formulated an effective global strategy. And what I would say is there are really three things we have to achieve at a strategic level as the United States of America. And one is we have to remain the world's largest economy. The only way to resource a global strategy is to have the economic power to do so. When we set up after the Second World War, we were 50% of global GDP. Today we're 25%, which is still the largest, but we want to be increasing our share of global GDP, which means American growth. We're a $20 trillion economy, and we want to become a $30 trillion. That's my opinion. The second is we need to convert the military alliance system into a trading community. I mean, these are other nations that do care about free markets, that do have shared values, that do have essentially parliamentary democratic systems. And we represent together 2/3 of global GDP. So we need to be working with each other, trading with each other. TPP is an example of that, though I think that was rejected in American politics for other reasons. But fundamentally, you're going to need a system that creates prosperity among our allies, from Japan to Britain. Bring India into this. India is going to be a big part of what we can do. Do that. And then third, we're going to have to do what I like to call economic containment of China. And that's going to be putting serious barriers up to commercial intercourse, so to speak, with our commercial relations with China, because we can't be facilitating their civil-military fusion, that is the building of their military-industrial complex. We can't be facilitating their human rights repressions. I mean, that's a system that's built by Chinese companies and banks and tech companies. We can't be participating in that. And from economic containment, we have to then maintain military deterrence. So remain the world's top economy, that's number one. Build out an alliance-based trading system, that's number two. And then three, economic containment with military deterrence. If we get all those things together, we're going to have a recipe for global growth. And at the same time, we're going to put China a little bit more into the rearview mirror. That's what we have to do. We have to outpace them over time.
It seems like the Trump era, Trump and his, I don't know what, Trumpism is doing the right thing in terms of recognizing China as a serious threat. When I say Trump, I mean like Sass and Rubio and Cotton. And I could see there being some new rules in place to keep American businesses from funding China. That part I feel like we're working on. It seems like Trump has done the opposite, though, when it comes to like trade with allies and global organizations to manage China. So what grade do you give as of now?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, the administration has going from engagement to competition, it's basically like pulling the handbrake on a superhighway. So that I think is a radical move. It was vital. It could have happened a lot earlier. It could have happened 10 years earlier. So that's very commendable that we are moving away from the engagement strategy. It had to be done. However, the next phase is going to be about global leadership. So that's really the question for the administration now, or whatever happens in the. I mean, it will have to. No matter who's in power, we have to start to engage the allies. But I also think that there have been a few accomplishments on that front. I mean, on one hand, one very significant accomplishment has been the USMCA. So having a potential North America as an economic powerhouse, I think that's the beginning of what you really fundamentally have to do. Is North America, US, Mexico, Canada has to become sort of a resource, technological and industrial powerhouse. And from that, you have sufficient gravity to bring the world's nations back into a long-term trading relationship that will prioritize the United States and North America over China and its Belt and Road. So that's much more significant than people think.
How's that different than NAFTA, though? How was that dramatically different?
Well, it's revised, and ideally it's improved. But I think that my point is only that it hasn't just been about there are gains when it comes to, I think, a strategic approach to how do we bring other states together to create economic power. I mean, that's the significant piece of that bucket. How does it compare to NAFTA is to be determined, but it is something that is I think indicates that there is that strategy to build with others. But now we have to go global. I mean, we're going to have and part of this, I mean, your point about the corporations is very important because, most corporates are in China, they're in sort of a prisoner's dilemma here, where let's say you take Boeing and Airbus, and the Communist Party, the Chinese government says to Boeing or to Airbus, they say, you better give us all your intellectual property or else we'll give market share to, your competitor. There isn't a single industry in China, working in China, operating in China today that hasn't been through that sort of coercion tactic. So we are going to have to work with our allies to resolve the prisoner's dilemma. I think you see this, very significantly in certain pieces of the tech sector where, you just have all kinds of search and replace type competitors. So as we try to execute export controls, another company can step in. So we, fortunately, they're all. I mean, it's the democracies that are ahead in tech, all things considered. Yeah. So we're going to have to work together.
Okay, so now I want to go to some of my prepared questions, and maybe we can sort of do. I'm just afraid that this is going to go because I feel like this is such an important topic. We could go multiple hours, and we may lose listeners to do that.
Right.
So I'll try to go quick. But you've mentioned earlier the South China Sea. We kind of glossed over that. Describe to listeners what has happened in the South China Sea over the last decade or so.
Sure. So the South China Sea, it's been claimed by Communist China for quite a long time. They have something called the 9-dash line, which basically says the entire South China Sea belongs to them. So that includes all its atolls and islands and such. And they've begun to build military outposts there. So essentially long-range runways. I mean, Hongqi 9s. I mean, they're putting in a whole bunch of stuff that will allow them to exert control in that sea. And what really matters about the South China Sea, I mean, on one hand, $4 trillion worth of international trade goes through those waterways every year. So this is it's really the waterway that connects Europe and Asia, that connects Africa and Asia. It's one of the most important waterways in the world. It's an entire sea. China is building a navy that's designed to control this place. And it's also, the South China Sea is really just a starting point for them to go out and go global with their ambitions, for them to be able to send their blue water navy out across the Indian Ocean, out into the Pacific. So it's really just a stepping stone for them to do much larger things in the future.
And you mentioned this area. Is it Xinjiang? Is that the area where you were?
Yes. Yes.
It's a big area. Apparently, it's like 3 times as big as France.
Right.
As many as 1 million people may be in re-education camps, among other horrors. You mentioned it, but I think it bears repeating. Talk about what's happening there.
Right. So Xinjiang is, it's the northwestern frontier area that borders, many of the stands, Pakistan and Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, thereabouts. And essentially, China has put at least 1 million, some people say up to 2 or 3 million people into concentration camps. These are re-education camps, which, essentially reports say they involve torture and, all kinds of, horrible stuff. I'll read you a quote from a Communist Party official about the education camps. He says, "You can't uproot all the weeds hidden among the crops in the field one by one. You need to spray chemicals to kill them all. Re-educating these people is like spraying chemicals on crops. That is why it is a general re-education, not limited to a few people." So there's that. But then also, again, back to China's global ambitions. Some Chinese strategists call Xinjiang the core area of the Belt and Road. And the reason, if we had a world map right here, we'd see that from Xinjiang, there's the China-Pakistan economic corridor, which puts China into the Arabian Sea, which puts China next to the Persian Gulf. And these are all pieces of the Belt and Road. So by taking control of Xinjiang, and this is a region that has been under military pressure from the communists since the founding of the People's Republic of China, they are able to set foundations to go broader and fulfill their international ambitions. So securing trade routes and other things like that. So it's a pretty horrible thing that's going on. I mean, they're putting the population into camps so that they can control this very large territory and use it as a staging point for other missions.
And of course, and I know this is in your book, we haven't talked about it yet here, but this social credit score just sounds so scary and dystopian. So this is a thing where, basically, well, why don't you just tell me about it? I think it's in place now, isn't it, in China?
I mean, the social credit score seems to, be applied in certain ways. I mean, it's still sort of a nascent project. But ultimately it corresponds to the Communist Party's vision of what they call social control, social management. And it's this idea that they can grade citizens according to, anything from their credit, from their sort of, financial score, let's say, to ultimately political loyalty. And the consequences that, are observable thus far is that people are denied train tickets, they're denied plane tickets, they're denied loans, things like that if they don't meet a certain score. So the idea that you're going to be ranked, essentially rated by the state, all goes to this concept of conditioning behavior according to the goals of the Communist Party of China. So it is a totalitarian vision. And it's one where the technology, as one great researcher who I've cited in China's Vision of Victory, it's like the technology is only just now catching up to the vision of the party, which has been for
It
this
seems super
comprehensive.
scary. I mean, there's like a very heavy-handed, authoritarian, obviously, side to it, but it also is like gamification, where like people like getting points. People like the more followers you have on Twitter, the cooler you are. Um, you've got the blue check, whatever. I mean, people like getting rewarded and like things that they can show off, right? So not only is it the very practical, I can't get a loan because I have a low social score. I mean, you could have people having fun trying to compete, boasting about their score, right? So you make it, instead of, in America, we had this thing, where like being rebellious made you cool,
Right.
protesting, growing your hair, listening to rock and roll music, being a rebel made you cool. Like China is setting up a system where like being uh, docile and going along with the government will make you cool.
Well, yeah, think about that. I mean, it's something where, I mean, we've talked a little bit about the sort of nationalism of society versus the nationalism of the party. And at the end of the day, wherever that bond of loyalty between citizen and state may be, this is the kind of thing that, as you point out, I mean, it's probably going to be a very different society than a democracy at the end of the day because of this.
Scary. So we talked about how it's hard to rein in American capitalists after telling them they can and should make money in China. It's going to be hard to sort of put that toothpaste back in the tube. And we've talked about the importance of building global alliances to manage China. What we haven't talked about is how it's going to be hard to keep them from doing business with China, right? I mean, like, even if we realize that, oh crap, we're now in a Cold War with this country, a lot of our allies, like, didn't England just sign up, to let them do their 5G or whatever? How are we going to get them to play, our allies to play ball and agree that we're all of a sudden in this Manichaean struggle?
I think that's where that's starting to happen, and the UK is a very good example. I mean, a year ago, Huawei was the central problem in US-UK relations, and the fact that even though you had many parliamentarians that understood the national security problem, you had, essentially Whitehall said, well, we want the China market, we want all of this, so we're going to go ahead and do this. But now they've reversed that. They're going to get Huawei out of their systems. And Britain apparently is taking the lead on bringing democracies together to do a 5G alternative. So, again, it took COVID-19, I think, for people to start to see the real problems of engagement with China. But China is, they're coercing all of our allies on their own anyhow. I mean, Japan now is spending a couple $2 billion. I mean, it's not a big number yet, but to get its companies to move manufacturing out of China. Then the Chinese have, threatened Australia with putting tariffs on their wine and beef, things like that. So all of this, I mean, the way that the Communist Party has exploited the global pandemic to push forward what they call a wolf warrior diplomacy and start coercing much more openly. I mean, things that would have taken shape behind the scenes in the past, but much more openly and publicly now. To coerce other states, we're starting to see the problem of economic engagement with China. So I think what we really need to figure out, and this is where the corporates matter so much, is we're going to need to have new growth strategies. I mean, if China is your base case for growth in the 2020s, not a good idea. You have to find another alternative growth case. And that still includes all the emerging markets. It still includes India. It includes all the potential of the developed nations and the emerging nations coming together for new synergies. So there's quite a wide world out there. And businesses are going to have to get smarter and better at figuring out the other 85% of the world that's not China's share of GDP.
All right. Well, I could keep, I think we could talk a lot longer, and there's a lot that I didn't get to ask you about, but my kids keep opening the door. So I think it's probably time for me to go. And
Sure.
and we can always leave the audience wanting more as well. But before we do that, anything that you wanted to say and or plug, what should we know and how can people read your stuff and keep in touch?
Yeah, well, people can certainly go to my website, Atlas Organization. That's chiefly for my consulting company, where we advise, U.S. companies and multinationals on essentially strategy towards Asia and the world. But then China's Vision of Victory is the guidebook to this whole situation. The national interest called it so they had the potential to create a new conversation on China, one that we desperately need to have. And the bottom line is it lays out all the primary documents that really matter, that explain the Communist Party's vision in their own words. So rather than hearing it from me, hear it from the real thing. And that's what I pulled together in the book. So I think, now more than ever, we need to remember that there is this deep vision of the future, that China's leadership holds. So whatever the events of the day, they have more and more to do with China, but we should all understand what it is that they have in mind, in the end.
Excellent. All right. Well, it's been a chilling, but thoroughly informative and also enjoyable discussion. Jonathan Ward, thank you for coming on the news.
Well, thank you, Matt. Great to be here.
All right, man. That was terrific.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for hosting me and really appreciate it. And just, let's stay in touch.
You got it, man. Well, you know how to reach me.
Awesome. Sounds good. Have a good one. Looking
Yeah.
forward to it, to the podcast.